They didn't hide it because it was harmless, they sealed it because it was dangerous. For years, a file existed with one name on it, Meghan Markle, and it didn't sit in a gossip column, a tabloid archive, or a Hollywood blacklist. It sat where stories don't leak, they wait, locked away, labeled, quiet, because what was inside wasn't meant to explode during a wedding countdown or a fairy tale montage. It was the kind of material institutions bury until the moment it becomes unavoidable. And now, cracks are forming. This story doesn't start at a palace or on a red carpet. It starts behind prison walls, where power doesn't matter anymore and reputation has already burned. A woman with nothing left to protect, nothing left to lose, and 20 years of time ahead of her allegedly decided to speak. Not loudly, not recklessly, carefully, strategically. A name surfaced, a document was hinted at, a past never fully explained suddenly felt very explainable. Because here's the thing people keep ignoring, the quiet years are always the loudest. Between 2004 and 2011, Meghan's public narrative goes soft. Auditions, hustle, small roles, hope, determination, a familiar story, but the photographs from that same window tell a different tale. Mediterranean decks, Monaco sunsets, invitations most struggling actors never even hear about, private gatherings, elite rooms, faces that don't just smile for photos, they open doors. People whispered then, they're whispering louder now. The claim is simple, but explosive, a CV. Not a RSUM you submit to casting agents, but one allegedly circulated through private networks where access matters more than credits. A document that didn't list auditions but availability, not skills but connections, dates overlapping with exclusive events, names tied to influence, travel that doesn't match income, introductions that don't happen by chance. If that document exists, it doesn't accuse, it maps. And according to what's now being murmured, that map looks uncomfortably familiar to anyone who once controlled elite social circuits with surgical precision, because those worlds don't run on luck, they run on recognition, patterns, orbit. You don't stumble onto those yachts, you're placed there. That's what makes this unsettling. Not proof, possibility. Because when someone who once engineered access looks at a trajectory and says, I've seen this before, people listen. Not because she's trusted, but because she knows how those systems move. She knows how ambition gets polished, how introductions become currency, how stories are edited before they ever reach daylight. And suddenly, the question isn't what was done, it's who noticed. When Meghan stepped toward royal life, something changed instantly. She wasn't just a bride, she became a security subject. In Britain, that isn't optional, it's protocol. Anyone entering that circle is examined quietly, thoroughly, and without sentiment. Travel, associations, gaps, patterns, everything. And so the file was opened. 7 years that never quite added up. Invitations that raised eyebrows. Social proximity to circles most outsiders never penetrate. According to later whispers, a dossier was compiled, not leaked, not summarized, sealed. The kind of report that doesn't use dramatic language but doesn't need to. Because inside intelligence work, the word concern already means something went wrong. And yet nothing stopped the wedding. No intervention, no public hesitation, no statement, no explanation. That's silence is where this story turns cold, because institutions don't ignore warnings casually. They weigh risk, they calculate fallout, they decide which outcome costs less. And when silence is chosen over transparency, it's usually because every option available carries damage. Fast forward to when prison whispers hit the public sphere years later. The palace could have ended it with one sentence: a calm denial, a reminder of vetting, a line drawn in ink. They didn't. No denial, no reassurance, no clarification, just stillness. And stillness at that level is never accidental. Why? Because speaking would force a choice. Either admit concerns existed or claim nothing existed at all. One option raises questions about judgment, the other risks future exposure. So the safest move became no move at all. While all of this sat locked behind doors, one person made decisions based on belief, loyalty, love, a version of the story he trusted completely. He defended, he fought, he walked away from everything he'd been raised to protect. And now the ground feels different. Because when information surfaces from places you never expected, when fragments of a past you thought you understood start aligning with questions you were never allowed to ask, certainty cracks. Not dramatically, quietly, like ice beneath your feet. This isn't about guilt. This isn't about crime. And this story does not claim involvement in anyone else's wrongdoing. What it questions is narrative, access, transparency, and why certain chapters were always told softly while others were sealed entirely. Imagine what happens if that alleged document ever appears, verified, time-stamped, aligned with known records. The impact wouldn't ripple. It would detonate. Brand stories collapse when timelines change. Institutions face scrutiny when silence is exposed, and personal choices feel heavier when based on incomplete truth. And the most dangerous part? The person hinting at this has only two currencies left: time and secrets. And secrets are worth more. Authorities don't trade on fantasy. They trade on information that leads somewhere. So the question hanging in the air isn't whether people are ready for the truth. It's whether the truth is ready to stop waiting. MI5 knows what was examined, the palace knows why it stayed quiet, and someone believes proof still exists. This story doesn't end with a rumor. It ends when a file opens or stays closed forever. What makes this story dangerous isn't noise, it's restraint. Because when institutions with centuries of survival instincts choose silence, they're not confused. They're calculating. And every calculation starts with one brutal question: which truth causes less damage if it comes out later? By the time the whispers reached public ears, the machinery had already moved on. Files don't disappear inside intelligence services. They age. They get reclassified. They get sealed under layers of procedural language designed to outlive outrage cycles. That's how power waits, patiently, confident that attention will drift. But attention didn't drift this time. Because the allegations didn't come from a blogger or a disgruntled insider chasing relevance. They came from someone who once lived at the center of elite access and now lives inside concrete walls with nothing but memory and leverage. A person who understands exactly how information is valued when freedom is no longer on the table. That's why the threat isn't scandal, it's structure. If a document truly exists, if a CV circulated through private networks outlining availability, introductions, travel, proximity, then it reframes everything that followed, not as destiny, not as fairy tale, but as trajectory, one that intersected with influence long before it intersected with royalty. And here's where the silence grows louder, because when British intelligence assesses risk, it doesn't ask whether something looks bad, it asks whether something creates exposure: political exposure, diplomatic exposure, reputational exposure, security exposure, the kind that doesn't explode immediately but destabilizes slowly, invisibly. If concerns were flagged, even softly, the system would have done what systems always do: mitigate, contain, delay, decide whether intervention creates more damage than inaction. And in this case, inaction won. The wedding went ahead. The optics were locked. The global celebration drowned out anything that might complicate the narrative. And once the world accepts a story emotionally, correcting it becomes almost impossible without collateral damage. That's the trap. Because now, years later, any admission, any clarification doesn't just address the past, it reopens every decision that followed, every defense made, every line drawn between truth and protocol. This is where MI5 becomes the most important character in the room without ever speaking. Intelligence agencies don't comment because commentary weakens authority, but they also don't stay silent when there's nothing to protect. Silence usually means there is something, just not something they're ready to own publicly. And that places the monarchy in an impossible position. Because if concerns existed and were overridden, that's a failure of judgment. If concerns existed and were buried, that's a failure of transparency. And if no concerns existed at all, then the refusal to say so becomes its own indictment. Every path leads to scrutiny. Meanwhile, on the personal side of this story, reality is far less abstract. Decisions were made, bridges were burned, a life was dismantled and rebuilt on the belief that the story presented was complete, that loyalty was justified, that warnings were rooted in bias, not briefing. Now imagine realizing those warnings may have come from rooms you were never allowed to enter, because princes don't get full intelligence briefings on their spouses. They get curated versions, sanitized summaries, enough to reassure but not enough to alarm. That's how institutions protect individuals from information they believe would destabilize personal decisions. But protection becomes manipulation when the truth eventually surfaces from somewhere else. If fragments of this past are now being learned secondhand from journalists, investigators, prison whispers, then the damage isn't just reputational, it's emotional, because the betrayal isn't about actions, it's about knowledge withheld. That's the crack forming beneath everything. And it's why this story refuses to die, because it isn't asking what happened, it's asking who knew and when. If that alleged CV ever becomes public, public, the fallout won't be limited to one person. It will hit brands that built campaigns on authenticity, institutions that leaned on silence, media outlets that repeated narratives without questioning timelines, and a public that was told certain questions were inappropriate to ask. The reckoning wouldn't be loud. It would be surgical. Partnerships would quietly dissolve. Invitations would dry up. Statements would be rewritten to sound supportive while distancing themselves just enough to survive. That's how reputational collapse looks in elite circles, not dramatic exits, but sudden absence. And then there's the broader implication no one wants to touch. Because if elements of this past overlap with networks that intelligence agencies monitor, not for gossip, but for leverage, then the issue becomes security, not scandal. It becomes about vulnerability, about who could apply pressure, about what could be used as influence. That's why this story never belonged in tabloids to begin with. It belongs in files. And files, once opened, don't close cleanly. This is also why timing matters, because the person hinting at this information didn't speak when it would destroy others for sport. She spoke when it could benefit her. That's not morality, that's survival. And survival has a way of sharpening truth until it cuts. Authorities don't reduce sentences for rumors, they do it for verifiable information that leads to new understanding, which means somewhere, someone will eventually ask for proof. And once that happens, the story stops being hypothetical. Until then, everyone waits. The palace waits because speaking risks too much. Intelligence waits because confirmation changes the game. Brands wait because denial is safer than engagement. And the public waits because instinct says there's more behind the curtain. The most chilling part isn't what might be revealed, it's how long it was allowed to remain hidden. Because secrets don't rot inside systems like these. They're preserved, cataloged, cross-referenced, waiting for the moment they become useful again. And that moment feels closer now. This story will end one of two ways. Either the silence holds and the file remains sealed forever, or one document surfaces, authenticated, undeniable, and everything shifts overnight. There is no middle ending. Only this certainty: someone knows exactly what was examined, exactly what raised concern, and exactly why the world was never told. And once secrets reach the point where silence costs more than exposure, they don't stay buried. They surface violently. Violently. Violently.